All right, cousins, back at it. Listeners, I've apologized to Marko profusely. I'll apologize to you now. It's just been a shit week and a half, literally, with Parent Corner and everything else. And also, Marko, you've been all over the world, so it's been hard to sync our schedules. But here we are. It's 7:30 Central Standard Time here in the United States. What is it in Riyadh, Marko?
It is 3:37 p.m.
Oh, okay. I don't. Will we hear the call to prayer at some point, wafting through the rooms as we're talking? I don't know. We'll find out. But so all that matters is that we're together again. Oddly enough, we were supposed to record. Our last session was set for 10 days ago, Marko, which is insane when I think about it. And we sent back and forth an outline about what we were going to talk about. And I actually think it's very instructive that here we are on May 3rd. And we decided we wouldn't change the outline. That the things that we were going to talk about 10 days ago are actually the things that we should talk about today. And I think there's a lesson in that. I think that the media is constantly, creating headlines, and this thing broke and this thing is crazy. But the things that actually matter, that actually move geopolitics, actually don't change that much. And I thought we would start by stealing yet another segment from our well, they're not our friends over at The Ringer. We want them to be our friends. We're desperate. I'm desperate, Ryan Russillo, for you to listen to this podcast and see in me the younger brother that you never had, or maybe you do have a brother. I don't know. I should look that up. But anyway, we thought we would do overreactions, just sort of like they did for the first round of the playoffs. So we'll do this for a little bit. Marko, over to you. What is your overreaction? What's a good overreaction from just... Yeah. Oh, no,
yeah, maybe... Ahead. Yeah, maybe, Jacob, it's a good idea to kind of like set the stage for what would that mean? Like, what? So that our listeners know sort of what it is that we're doing.
Great. So what would happen is, let's say it's the first round. Let's say it's the first game of the NBA playoffs. And this is not what happened. But let's say that the Lakers had taken game one from the Timberwolves in the playoff series. An overreaction would have been, the Lakers are going to steamroll through the entire playoffs. This is the greatest Laker team since the first Kobe and Shaq team almost went undefeated all the way to the championship. LeBron is incredible. He's 25 again. Luka, he's learned to play defense. He's dieting. He's on the paleo, all vegetable. I don't know how that works together. Diet. Everything is great. The Lakers are going to win the championship. That would be an example of an overreaction. Taking one data point and extrapolating and saying, oh my God, this huge thing is happening based on one data point. That in retrospect, they lost in 5, was it? Not so great.
Okay. So, that's exactly what it is. So basically, effectively, it's what the media does for a living.
Pretty much, but I have a nice spin on it. So I'm going to give you first take at it, and then I'm going to try and do one, which I'm probably going to embarrass myself on, but we'll see. So what's your first overreaction?
Super. Okay. Well, for those of you who are not really sort of interested in markets, this may be kind of news to a lot of people out there. But the US dollar has basically declined year to date by almost 8%. And this is the sort of DXY. This is a way to sort of look at the dollar against most major currencies. You can Google it, you can look it up. Most of the DXY is really the euro. So that's what it's, being bet against. And obviously, if you're just sitting at home in St. Louis or New Orleans or LA, you're like not aware of this really, maybe a little bit through some rising cost of imports. But I think that my first overreaction is that it's going down to 50%. Now, a lot of you might be sitting, a lot of you are sitting there like, wait, what? The US currency is going to lose half of its value. First of all, just a little reminder, this happened in the early 2000s. From 2001 to 2004, this is basically what happened. And it wasn't because the United States of America disappeared off the face of the earth, or it was weaker, or there was a loss of reserve currency status. It just happened for good old macroeconomic reasons. Growth differentials, basically the rest of the world. There was a very compelling narrative that the rest of the world was doing great. China was industrializing. The world needed more commodities like energy and copper and steel and iron ore and all that good stuff in order to industrialize China. And so the other thing was that the 1990s were a great decade for America. Like, stellar. 2 terms of Bill Clinton, balanced budget, pretty much this idea of great moderation. Inflation was under check. tech boom, huge tech boom. Granted, different from the one today. Different one from the one today in that there were a lot of dot-com companies that were basically a joke, like petfoods.com. Um, and that said, I would say that while that's not the case this time around, because most of the tech companies that are publicly listed that you can invest in are pretty damn good companies. I do think that there's an absolute ton of nonsense that the tech bros have been plunging down the throats of my clients in the private space. I would say that that's where this sort of .com-ish like speculation has been the greatest. But the point is that a decade of American awesomeness gets followed by by a 5-year period in the early 2000s where the US doesn't do well. And so what I would say to you, those of you who are just casually kind of listening to this, not looking for market advice because we don't usually give it, I would say that that's my first overreaction. First overreaction is, first 4 months of this year. I mean, 4 months. For those of you who are crypto traders and Bitcoin fans, when you hear 8% in 4 months, bro, that's like one day. I get that. But US dollar is a very liquid, large currency, obviously the largest. So that kind of a move in 4 months is pretty much insanity. So my first overreaction is that this thing is going to collapse. Now, that said, we're in a little bit of a rally right now. So that's probably going to go on for a couple of months. And then I think the wheels are going to come off. So practical advice for practical people. That's what we're here for, Jacob. What does this mean? First and foremost, if your liberal friends tell you this is because of Donald Trump, you should counter by saying, not really. This was going to happen anyways. Why? Over the last 5 years, the US has basically spent so much fiscal space. It's basically the government's been spending a lot of money, and that's going to go in reverse. This is classical macroeconomics 101 that we all slept through when we were 19, but you cannot borrow from the future forever. So this was always going to end. And I think actually if Vice President Harris became the president, it would have been kind of more obvious to people, because the Republicans in the House would have turned into Tea Party fiscal conservatives like day one of her presidency. So on one hand, this was going to happen anyways. But when you put tariffs on penguins, it's going to happen a little faster, So that's the first thing. So my first kind of way to spin this is if somebody comes to you and starts blaming Donald Trump for this, I would say yeah, maybe, or maybe he just has greased the wheels of what was going to happen anyways. The second,
let me don. Well, hold on. Let me don the patchouli-soaked, smelling jacket of your liberal friend, and just say for a moment that makes sense, Marko. But who was the one who pushed tax cuts at the peak of the cycle and bullied the Fed into cutting interest rates and blew out the deficit greater than any previous president since World War II? Which one was that? Oh, was that the first Donald Trump administration? Oh, okay. So yes, let's not blame the second Trump administration. Let's blame the first Trump administration. When that patchouli friend comes to you, what's your rejoinder?
Easy rejoinder.
Easy. Oh, I was trying to make it harder. I should have tried harder. Okay, go ahead. Easy. Put me in my place.
So first of all, yes, what you're referring to is, of course, the 2017 tax cut, which was the first instance of what nerds would call a pro-cyclical fiscal stimulus, which is a fancy way of saying burning through cash when you don't need to. Everything's going fine, and you're just like, let's cut some taxes, yo. So yes, that was Trump. But then I think 2 other things happened. First of all, during the pandemic, the US spent 4 times more than pretty much any other major economy. It was insane. It was an orgy of spending. And that wasn't just Trump. That was what I like to call the Trump-Pelosi administration. The two of them were locked in sync like a married couple who had been together for 60 years. They were just in sync. He would tweet how he wants $1 trillion stimulus. She would tweet back oh yeah, that's it, 2 trillion. And then he would obviously come back and be like, yo, 3. So the second stage of that orgy of fiscal stimulus was really with the blessing of the Democratic Party and Nancy Pelosi. And then the third stage was all Biden all the time, right? So when he became the president, totally unnecessary 2.1 trillion package, the vaccine was already discovered. It was in production. COVID had mutated into a softer, form. And so it was pretty clear that the economy was going to recover. And yet he was like, well, Donald and Nancy did like 5 trillion. Why can't I do 2.1? And then after that, of course, CHIPS Act, Infrastructure Act, Inflation Reduction Act, or rarely in the name if there ever was one. And so that would be my counter. That yes, Trump kind of ripped the Band-Aid off of like orthodoxy and prudence. But then Joe Biden was like, oh my, like I can do this? What? Let's go. Now, so that's my first way to kind of think about this. When somebody comes to you and tries to explain it and just blames it on one side, I would say, hold up. Now, the second thing is, what do I do with this? Well, first of all, it's May. You might want to go to the Caribbean for Memorial Day or spring break, or maybe for Thanksgiving. Book those passages right now. Book those packages right now. Right now. Like, book them. Okay? Don't wait. I've got lots of kids. I like to take you to the Caribbean. And I know they like to take the payment up front. Give it. Don't wait. Just give the payment while there's any value left in the US dollar. If you've always wanted to spend a summer in Europe, if you've wanted to go see New Zealand, I highly recommend it. Middle East, to just spend a great time here. Although the Middle East actually doesn't matter because they're mostly pegged to the dollar, but that's like a nuance that, we don't have to get into. The point is, you want to travel, you want to see the world, baby, go right now. Book it. GTFO, while the currency in your pocket, if you're American, still has some value.
Well, I think from now on we should call the Pelosi-Trump administration the plump administration. I think that's nice. You can give me credit for that when you're going
like
forward.
A triple entendre.
Yeah, there you go. And this is as good a time as any, maybe, to announce our new sponsor for the podcast, the Papich and Shapiro Travel Agency. If you use the code COUSINS for our website, you will get 10% off your bookings to the Caribbean. I'm kidding. I bet I'm going to get at least one email or one review that is like, oh God, this guy is hawking travel agency now in addition to all the other things that he's doing. Just a joke. Calm down. Okay. My first overreaction. We're each going to do 2 of these. This is from a couple of different things that have come out over the last couple of weeks, and maybe you saw some of them, Marko. So some Chinese scientists published an article that they had cracked the code on increasing memory speeds, creating the fastest flash memory ever created. It can erase and rewrite data in 400 picoseconds. A picosecond is 1/trillionth of a second. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce that word. Huawei is readying new AI chips for mass shipment as China seeks alternatives from NVIDIA and seems to be pretty good. The first production under the NACSTRA ban for a sodium-ion battery for EVs with an energy density of 175 watt-hours per kilogram, which is roughly equivalent to a lithium iron phosphate battery. That's in production now by Chinese manufacturers, was unveiled at Tech Day by CATL, which is the big Chinese battery maker. And then turns out a former ASML head scientist has been driving a new breakthrough in China building extreme ultraviolet light source platform, so EUV technology that helps create chips. For those of you who don't follow along at home, EUV equipment is probably the hardest thing for China to replicate in its semiconductor supply chain. So the overreaction is China's already won the tech war. They're completely taking over. All the United States is doing is drilling, and doing these other things. Bow to our Chinese tech overlords. Get ready to use WeChat and Alipay and all these other things, the China GPTs. We are closer to Blade Runner than ever before, except it's going to be Chinese replicants running around cleaning the streets of Los Angeles. What do you think?
Wow. Okay. So first of all, I have 3 degrees in political science. So most of what you just said is incomprehensible to me. I would just say that we should bring a.
It's Chinese to you. There you go. See,
it's Mandarin. Yeah. Look, that's great. I'm on a 3-week trip around the world. So I was in Hong Kong and Singapore last week. This week, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. Next week, I'm going to be in Europe. And so what I would say to you is that I had the opportunity in Hong Kong to kind of duck into a couple of car showrooms, of Chinese car manufacturers. looked great, like really looked great. I was picked up in Dubai by a BYD, basically Tesla alternative. It was cool. It was fine. Um, but I have to say that I think that people are overreacting a little bit when it comes to cars. All this other stuff, awesome. But when it comes to cars, I think that this idea that like it's game over for other manufacturers is a little bit overhyped. And the reason I say that is that every single car that I've driven in that's Chinese made, it's awesome. Like I have nothing bad to say. It's just that it does feel kind of like a very cool Tesla or a Hyundai. And yes, I just compared Tesla with a Hyundai. I have no idea why Tesla boys and Tesla fans love it. It feels cheap inside. Sorry. And if you think that going 0 to 40 in 2.6 seconds makes for a good car, like, okay, cool. Like, I mean, that does not make a good car. So Teslas feel extremely cheap inside. That's just my personal opinion. And I think that the Chinese brands are kind of going down the same, that they're very cool, sleek, technology inside is great. I still want a German built car. And maybe that's because I'm an old fart. But that's just the way I feel. So I don't know. I was impressed, and at the same time, didn't walk away thinking that we will all be driving Chinese cars over the next 10 years.
We may not be. I think the bigger issue is, are the chips that are going to go into most of the cars in the world, are they going to be made in China, or is China going to be able to replicate some of these more complex parts of the supply chain? And it's too early to say. Like, I threw some stuff out there, but like, the flash memory thing, it's some scientists. So it's a Nature article. It's not like anything close to production. The sodium ion thing is kind of interesting. The
It
EUV
is.
thing, again, you're probably years away from doing that. But if any of those things were real, like if it wasn't just some Chinese nerds posting something in a journal, but it was like, oh no, we're going to, allocate, some bazooka level of stimulus so that this goes out to global markets next year, like any one of those four things could be transformative. And you hear some of these things percolating in China, even as the United States is slashing money for research and innovation and arguing about who goes in what bathroom and whether universities are using their funding correctly. Like, it's just a tale of two worlds. So it's an overreaction, but there's a kernel of truth to it. Yes, please.
Can I take this further? Can I overreact even further?
Yeah, I'm just gonna please Stephen A. it. Go all the way.
I'm gonna Stephen A. it. So the Industrial Revolution is a product of effectively trade wars. So let me explain. The United Kingdom basically deforested itself in medieval times. And it was one of the few regions of Europe that was importing wood for fuel because it kind of ran out, and if you have ever been to England, the rolling green hills, like, not a lot of trees. And so they were importing wood from the Baltic region. So today, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And this wood had to pass through the Danish control of the Jutland Straits. And the Danes, being Danes, were always kind of scheming on England and the British Isles. And so they would impede this flow of wood from time to time. Now, at the time, everybody knew that coal existed. This was like a known quality. Everybody knew it. But nobody wanted to use it because it's dumb. It's heavy. It doesn't grow in trees. You can't just walk outside of your house, get some coal and warm yourself up. But you can't do that with a tree. And it's dirty. So when the Brits started using coal more than anyone else, the rest of Europe was not afraid. They were like, hey, you're using coal. Suck to you. And so the problem with coal is that it's concentrated geographically, obviously, in a coal mine. And then the other problem is it's heavy, so you got to move it around. So at first, the English did what everybody else does. They dug canals. It's extremely expensive, incredibly expensive. And then they were like, hey, why not burn some coal in a cauldron, make steam out of it, and then move the coal around? And that was effectively the start of the steam engine and eventually railroads, and so on. So the reason I cite this example, I mean, look, just to be clear, there were many other factors. Obviously, England had governance, it had great legal system. Like, there's a lot of things that were also sort of inherently English. I don't want to take that away from England's role in starting the Industrial Revolution. But the reality is that they did it out of necessity. And so if you're a member of the Trump administration and you're listening to this, first of all, I just wanted to be clear that when mass deportation starts, I'm the one taking your side more than Jacob is. I just want that to be clear.
I'm fine with that being clear too.
Second of all, the second point I want you to hear is that you're not going to stop China innovating. In fact, by allowing China to potentially develop completely alternative systems, you could be creating the next superpower. So in other words, having China be addicted to American technology, fine, slow down their access to the newest stuff, that's fine. But trying to completely eliminate their access to US technology will lead them to create their own standards and potentially completely new technological innovation, because necessity is the mother of all invention. And the US has just given China huge necessity for innovation. So I'm just going to leave it there. And there's your overreaction to your overreaction.
That's perfect. And while you were talking, it just crystallized to me that Peter Zeihan serves the role of Skip Bayless in our geopolitics ecosystem, because I'm just thinking of how he would turn that into a signal that China is actually going to collapse any day now. All right, next overreaction, over to you.
Oh, yeah. So it's my turn. So it's interesting because, last 12 months of speaking to clients in the financial world, all over the world, Europe has been left for the dead. And nowhere has that been more clear than in Europe, actually. So when you would show up and speak to European clients all throughout 2024, there was just this resignation that Europe is, in fact, a museum. That's now become clear. And I think that the flip side of my overreaction in the US dollar, of course, is the surge in the euro, which has been quite astonishing as well. And so the other overreaction that I would have is that we're going to be in Europe's decade. And that Europe is actually going, we're going to be in Europe's decade, because everybody thinks it's China decade. Everybody thinks it's an America decade. Skip Bayless thinks LeBron is still going to play at 40, right? No, that's the opposite. He hates
the
LeBron,
opposite.
right?
He hates LeBron. He thinks LeBron.
Right, Right. Shannon Sharp. Okay, then. Shannon Sharp is out there. Lakers in 5, baby. But yeah, so
also out there saying it wasn't me or whatever other trouble he's gotten into, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, so I think that the flip side of this sort of a US slowdown could actually be Europe. And the reason I would say this is that I think what we're missing here is that if we really are in a world where the US administration is asking companies to build robust supply chains, if we are in a world where everybody wants to drive an EV, no matter how much of a nonsense that is from actually climate change perspective, because the average EV requires 200 kilograms of metals, whereas the average internal combustion engine requires 30 to 40 kilograms, but whatever. So if that's really the world we're in, Europeans are actually really good at producing the stuff that goes into that world. If you look at Germany's exports, only 16% of it is cars. 40+% is machines and machine tools. Don't ask me what that is. I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is that it's not just cars. It's actually a lot of things that are required if you suddenly need to get a lot of minerals and metals out of the ground in order to put them into EV. If you suddenly have to build new assembly lines in Vietnam, in Mexico, in all sorts of other countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, well, then you're going to kind of need European companies. And so I think that Europe has been left for the dead, and I think that's a mistake. And I think that it's going to actually outperform potentially everybody over the next 5 years.
Perfect. Okay. Last overreaction from me. You might have heard this. Mike Waltz has been not fired, but apparently demoted to U.S. Secretary to the United Nations. He was the National Security Advisor. Marco Rubio will now, on an interim basis, take over that position. I believe it is the first time since Henry Kissinger served both as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor that the same man has been doing the same thing. Or that the same man has been fulfilling both of those roles. And here's the overreaction. So Waltz was known primarily as a national security hawk within the Trump administration. He was in favor of more sanctions against Russia. He was super hardline on Iran. You can imagine, I don't know his exact positions on China. I didn't have a chance to look at them, but I'm sure that they are in keeping with his other hawk tendencies. So here's the overreaction. The better angels of the Trump administration's nature has won. The warmongers have been kicked out. The deep state operatives have been identified and shown to exit stage left. This is going to be a peace dividend for years to come. We will have an Iran nuclear deal, a phase 2 and 3 China trade agreement. There will be peace in the South China Sea, peace in all of the different oceans around the world, and President Trump will be hoisting his Nobel Peace Prize. And it all began with getting rid of Mike Waltz and the hawkish voices that were forcing Trump to do the things that he didn't want to do in the administration.
Boom. All right, right off the bat, there's 3 things I want to say. First and foremost, who had on their bingo card that Marco Rubio is the next Henry Kissinger? Come on, identify yourself.
I had that he probably thought of himself that way, but why one would want to think of oneself that way is a different question. But no, I don't think anybody had that on the bingo card.
Right? Like, I mean, when this happened and Marco Rubio stepped in, I was like, wow. I would not have guessed that. So that's very interesting.
What is that old quote? I forget who said it, that history repeats itself. First is tragedy and second is farce. I mean, this is farcical.
Although, I would say that some of Marco Rubio's speeches have been, pretty impressive, I would say. But I would also say that to fully become Kissinger, he has to take over the presidency, because there is this old sort of story that actually Henry Kissinger was running the United States of America during the Ford presidency, when Ford was pretty much like, I'm done, like, I'm not going to contest the next election. And basically Kissinger was like in charge. So that's maybe Marco Rubio will be in charge next. The second thing I would say on this point, I find it hilarious that in finance, I think some investment banks have like a Peter Navarro tracker. Like, how many days has Navarro not appeared on television? Now, for those of you who are not following this closely, and this podcast is for you, so it's not for, you don't have to be an expert in any of this to listen to us. Peter Navarro is the most hawkish, trade, anti-China economic advisor to President Trump. He literally wrote the book titled Death by China. And so right after April 2nd, when President Trump imposed those tariffs, Peter Navarro came out and was like, this is not a negotiation. This is not a negotiation, which was hilarious because I was actually on CNBC being interviewed live on this question. They asked me, well, what do you think? Because, I think it is a negotiation. They were like, well, Marco, Peter Navarro disagrees with you. And I was like, I don't care. And they literally cut my interview short and had like another journalist come on and say, President Trump just said it is a negotiation. I was like, yeah, yes. But the point is, there's literally a tracker in some financial firms. They're actually tracking how long he hasn't said a single thing on Bit Media. And so, yeah, I think that it's not that much of an overreaction, Jacob, that, Waltz is out, Navarro silenced, because it's time for negotiations. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily over. The third thing I would say is that I think that when you see who President Trump appointed as defense secretary and director of intelligence, I think that Mike Waltz was actually always in a minority. Mm-hmm. I think that someone who's a national security hawk was probably always uncomfortable to begin with. So, yeah.
I'm sure he'll feel way more comfortable at the United Nations, that bastion of national security hawks. All right, so to recap, your overreaction of the past 10 days of events, the dollar is going to be cut by 50%. Chinese tech is going to have an industrial revolution that will leave us all behind. It is Europe's geopolitical decade, and President Trump will win a Nobel Peace Prize because he fired Mike Waltz. Those are some pretty good overreactions that we were able to put together there.
By the
I
way,
like that.
honestly, I just think that for the sake of hearing his winning speech alone, I think I genuinely, I'm not kidding, I'm not being sarcastic. I want Donald Trump to win the Nobel Peace Prize because I want to hear that speech. That will go down in history with the Gettysburg Address as like the most quoted presidential speech ever. Prove me wrong.
Will it come before or after he also offers a speech as the next pope?
Well, that's a segue,
Pope.
I believe, into our next topic.
It can be, actually. I was going to say we should spend some time on India and Pakistan first before we go into the Pope. But
nuclear war potential.
Nuclear war.
Let's go into the Vatican. I watched the movie Conclave. I watched it.
Okay, I haven't watched yet.
Boy, did they time that release well. Let me tell you. Hollywood, baby. Out there in LA, they know their geopolitics. They timed the conclave perfectly to the poor man's death. But yeah, so the Pope is dead, and you wanted to talk about this, which I found intriguing. So I want to see where you take this.
Yeah, I don't know quite where I'm going to take this because I've been hearing lots of things about this, and there are conspiracy. I mean, it's the Vatican. There have been conspiracy theories around this for a long time. But I mean, when you think about the Catholic Church as an institution, we're still talking about an institution that represents, roughly 1.4 billion people worldwide. We're talking about an institution. I'm just bringing up a map of majority Catholic countries in the world. You're talking about most of South America. You're talking about large swaths of Southern Europe. You're talking about there are even some parts of Africa that are majority Catholic. We can throw in the Philippines, some things like that. So, I mean, you're talking about a potential major force there. And the reason there are a couple different reasons I think it's interesting. There are these conspiracy theories behind the scenes that, now they're going to appoint some conservative who's going to retake the Catholic Church, or is going to go back on double down on this messaging of defending Western civilization against the rising tide of Chinese tech, blah, 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 blah. But for me, the more interesting thing is that, Pope Francis maybe was the last gasp of a globalizing world. Like he really, we don't have to talk about his humility and his religious principles and things like that. But he was part of a world where it was like, okay, we're going to have a South American Pope, and we're going to be humble, and it's going to be about spreading the faith. And he was a voice of reason and of conscience. Even if you disagree with what he said, he would come out and criticize leaders for not treating migrants well, and come out and say this is not something that is good. And I don't know. I feel like sort of like how Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. So when a Supreme Court justice in the United States is appointed or confirmed, or whatever the correct word there is, they're sort of a snapshot of what morality and conscience was at that particular point in time. And then when they're 40 years later and they're barely hanging on to their marbles and they're still, on the bench, they feel completely out of practice. I sort of feel like Pope Francis was that the world had changed around him, and that he was a pope that was chosen for a world that is no longer there. I'm thinking, you can tell that I'm a little ambivalent here, but I'm trying to think through, does the next pope, whoever the next pope is, does it matter who it is? Like if it is a conservative figure, is it going to reinforce some of the things that we've seen in geopolitics? Could they go the opposite direction? Could it be a more universalizing force? And is religion going to cut against sort of the drive for multipolarity and all these other different things? So that was just the first place I wanted to take it, because it is, like I said, it's imagine if India has 1.2 billion people, China has 1 billion people. I'm not saying the Catholic Church is a state, but 1.4 billion people look to the Pope for guidance, think that he's the vicar of Christ on earth, or whatever the right terminology is. I'm sure I'm butchering it. So I don't know. What do you think? And who better than a Jew and whatever you are to talk about this in depth?
Nihilist. I believe in nothing, Lebowski.
A Jew and a nihilist. Right.
Yes. Well, first of all, that was a very, very nice, recount of Pope Francis's time. So did not expect that. I'm caught off guard because usually I see everything as a lark, and now I have to follow that very sober and serious segment. Like you just took me off. I mean, I was here. My notes are about Trump being the Pope. You know what I mean? How do I follow up with what
I
you
mean,
just said?
I'm really curious what name he would choose for himself. Would he just be Donald? Would he be
Just Donald.
Donaldus?
Obvious.
Like
Come on, man. Like,
just
obviously, just Trump, Pope Trump.
Pope Trump, Pope Trump the
You know,
first.
I actually dropped this on one of my very liberal friends. I was like, because he said something like, "I can't believe the man said he wants to be the Pope," and I was like, "Yes, but as a liberal, would you not want him to take over the papacy and therefore not be the president? Huh? Huh?
Well, no,
Right?
he would be both at the same time. What would prevent him from being both?
Yeah, that's what my
He's not
friend said.
thinking he's not thinking he's giving up the presidency. We're going to
All right,
finally usher in the Vatican conspiracy that that the
this
anti-Catholics in
was
the United States for literally centuries were like, oh my God, the Pope is ruling Washington, and Trump is like, I'm going to be the like JFK is like, what the f? Do you know how much I had to go through just to get elected? And this guy's going to say out loud he wants to be the Pope.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, look, I think first of all, I think the Vatican is an incredible institution, and I think it's one of the ways that Italy and the West, like broadly conceived, I think the West solved a really important problem, which was, first of all, the Vatican is obviously the closest thing to living Rome that we have, like Roman Empire.
Mhm.
Like, number one. Number two, it really helped, I think, the West advance scientifically, culturally, sociologically by effectively creating a sovereign state that also captured the religion, but then created it in like a couple of square blocks in like Rome. Like, this is what you get. Okay, so just to be clear, you get this space, nothing else, and you're focused on religion, but religion and the state are separate. And I think a lot of problems in the world could be solved if other religions followed suit and actually created their own, sort of sovereign entities that represent the religion, gave them a seat at the UN as the Vatican has. Well, I think it's a non-voting uh, General Assembly seat. But like the point is, I think if every religion had that kind of a very clear separation, so in a way, yes, sovereignty as a sovereign, but also separation from all the other countries, it would actually be very helpful because then there would be less and less of an appeal to religions on a sovereign nationalist level. So that's one. The second thing is I think that it will be interesting who is picked. I'm not sure that this was the last globalized pope. I think the Vatican is very much, aware that that growth of Catholicism is greatest in non-Western, or rather, maybe not non-Western, but definitely not Northeast planet, North America and Europe. And so I actually think that you might have an Asian pope. That would be my bet. Somebody from Asia.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking like a geopolitical strategist, like that would make some sense. That seems to be the place where you could have the most growth. But I think it's going to be interesting because I think it's going to be a reflection of even how the Vatican is seeing the world. Like, are they seeing the world with a small p, where it's the goal is to be progressive, which is to spread the faith as far as possible, and I mean, if you're one of the conservative critics of Francis, to water things down so that more and more people will nominally like look to the Vatican and look to Catholicism? Or is it going to be no, Pope Francis took us too far in this direction. We need to conserve, like be conservatives with a small c, the tradition. We need to buttress the strength of Catholic civilization against the rising threats that it faces on all these different sides. We're not watering it down. We're not spreading the faith. We're protecting the faith from the attacks that are coming onto it. That might be too simplified, but if I was in conclave and they were asking, what is the geopolitical strategist? I'd say, well, this is a multipolar world. It's more competitive. You have nations that are arming themselves for future conflict and fighting trade wars and preparing to fight future wars. What is the role of a universalizing religion with, as you said, a non-voting seat at the General Assembly in that world? Are you on one side or the other? Are you you want to be there in general? Like the Vatican has not generally been neutral in lots of parties. Like didn't really acquit itself well during the World War II years. So I don't know.
No, I would suspect that in the modern world you do want to just pick up as many followers as you can. I mean, this is like a sim game, like, so no, I would bet it's in the next pope is from Asia. and I think they continue Francis's progressivism. That's my bet. What would your bet be? A conservative Italian?
Yeah, or like, yeah, I think so. Like something like that, or like somebody from New York, like returning it to like I don't know if I actually believe this yet. And what do I know? I know nothing about the that's the inner
It's
workings of
okay.
the Vatican. But
This is
I'll
why we have two Muppets on the cover
exactly.
of our like yes. So okay, we'll see what
But
happens.
no, but I'll take the opposite view. I'll say if you get a choice that is reactionary and conservative, then that is telling you that even religion is bending towards some of these nativist protectionist forces that seem to have infected most political discourse. And I don't think religious discourse and political discourse are that separate, at least in modern parlance. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh no,
Can I
go.
can I
Please.
just like riff off of that? I mean, I am leaving the
Riff.
Pope discussion. This is probably the most we've ever going to discuss about Pope, but it's interesting because Australia and Canada just had their elections. We're not going to really spend a lot of time on that, but they kind of went the other way, you know. And this is one of the things that I think is interesting. I mean, like in Canada, the Conservative Party, not the Conservative Party of Canada, is in any way a MAGA party at all, at all. They support universal health care. They want to cut down the size of the government, as most center right parties want, but like not in a sort of haphazard way. So it was interesting. They gave up almost a 30% lead over the Liberal Party. And absolutely that had to do with Donald Trump. Although, as I tweeted, it also had to do with the fact that Liberal Party basically did what the Democratic Party in the US did, but just the right way. So I compared to the Liberal Party to Masai Ujiri and the Democratic Party to Nico Harrison. Um, you know, and so obviously being the fact that Masai got Kawhi for 1 year and Nico got AD for like 12 games that he's going to play for the rest of his career.
Yeah, that's rough because that makes Kamala AD in that comparison. That's
I,
rough for
I did
AD. Anyway, go on.
absolutely. Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, yeah. I like how you feel bad for AD in that comparison. Anyways, this was for those 0.7% of our fans that look for this kind of analogy, but and stretched metaphors. But I think that obviously in Canada, it was more than just rejection of like nativism or center right, because again, I don't think that's fair to the Conservative Party in any way, shape, or form in Canada. But Mark Carney did surge, and he was obviously a very good candidate. And then in Australia, the current government of Albanese basically won. And again, not that it was surprising necessarily, but I do think it would have been difficult, maybe for center right party to win in this context. Again, I don't want to overstate it, but I'm not sure that President Trump. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it all depends on performance. Thus far, the performance has been questionable, to say the least. And thus far, I think President Trump is going to have to work a lot harder. I mean, obviously, the stock market, the economy, we're probably headed into a recession. We'll see what happens. Um, but I think that President Trump has to start making some victories, or else he could cause a lot of center right parties to struggle to identify their direction going forward.
I think Canada and Australia are interesting test cases there because the way that I would interpret that in some sense, it's remarkable that Carney surged as much as he did, and it's a remarkable own goal from President Trump too, because he had his finger on the pulse of Canadian politics exactly right when he basically forced Trudeau out of office, but then doubling down on this 51st state nonsense and basically giving wind to Carney's sails. The Conservative Party in Canada, I think, would have been a more willing partner to work with President Trump on renegotiating USMCA and being more aligned. And instead, he just kept jabbing them with the dagger of, 51st state, you should be the 51st state, and bringing that up to Carney. But I'm not sure that it's a vote against, I don't know, nativism and
Nativism.
words like that get pejorative. But like, if you're a middle power like Canada or like Australia, where your national security future has been based on the United States, but your trade, well, this is not true of Canada, but your trade future really is dependent on a globalizing free trade world, then what President Trump is talking about is basically complete subservience to the United States or catastrophe if you don't go along with it. And you're not just seeing that in these countries. I mean, look at the way that Japan has reacted to some of the heavy-handedness of
Yeah,
the Trump administration's tariff
great
war over
example.
just the past couple of weeks. They're saying we're not going to do anything to jeopardize our relationship with China. Sorry, no, if you don't withdraw the tariffs, like we're not going to go along with this. Like we have our own interests, and I think there is this class of middle power, like with apologies if they don't like that term, but like your Canada's, Australia's, Japan, they have to carve out a space where at least in that space, free trade still means something, so they can
Mm.
at least survive to some of it. So I think you can actually make the argument that if you're being pragmatic and you're being uber nationalist about your country and your country's interests, and you see what the United States is doing, the best policy you can have is to reject picking sides. It's to say, no, we're not on the U.S. side and we're not on the Chinese side. We're going to assemble the middle powers as much as possible, and then we'll pragmatically use our influence to go back and forth with the others. I think I'm stretching there, but that's how I've been trying to think about that shit.
I'm glad you brought up Japan, because that is probably the most important thing that's happened in terms of the trade negotiations over the last couple of weeks. Not only did Japan say no to in any way curbing its relationship with China, not only did they say that, but they are actually the only country. I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're the only country to ever openly threaten to sell U.S. treasuries, and that was dramatic, and that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, China has never suggested that. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe some official at
Not
some point
publicly.
has.
No, I think not publicly. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, so the fact that Japan did it, just said like, look, our hold. They were very like polite about it, but I think it was something like, look, our holding of U.S. treasuries is a factor in these negotiations, or should be. And it was like, whoa, what? Like the record skips behind. That is, I think, a signal to President Trump that, look, if Japan, which allows you to have military bases on its territory, if Japan, which is extremely proximate to China, which is clearly a historical rival to Japan, if Japan is not willing to bend, how are you going to bend anyone else? I mean, so I still believe that those 90 deals in 90 days are going to happen. Um, there's just going to be a whole lot of LNG import promises. I think Japan is going to do something they haven't done in perhaps thousands of years. They're going to import rice. I do think they're going to like curb their sort of political resistance to that. And then they're going to just send it off to Vietnam or Myanmar, or I don't know, sink it to the bottom of the ocean. Like, we don't want your Uncle Ben's.
Yeah. Wait. So, explain what you mean to me about Japan importing rice, though. I thought they did import rice. Is that not right?
Oh, they might. I don't know, but I think they have restrictions. Same as Europeans do to protect their farmers. Japan does the same. They may have on some occasion, but Japan does have pretty strict import non-tariff barriers to trade, phytosanitary rules, so that it can protect its farmers. I mean, this is a huge component of their domestic politics, overrepresentation of rural districts in the Diet. And so, from what I understand, they do not import a lot of American rice, if any. And so if they actually told President Trump that they would import American agricultural products, it would be a big deal.
Yeah, American agricultural products for sure. Rice, I know they've been having increases in rice prices because of some of the problems in rice production globally this year, but that's some homework for us. Last thing on Japan is just that I think you can also see here, it's reflective of President Trump's style, which is he thinks about leader to leader and one-on-one sort of negotiations. And he had a very, very tight relationship with Shinzo Abe. But Shinzo Abe is not the leader of Japan anymore. He's not there. And I can't help but think if maybe Trump took Japan for granted because of his old relationship with Shinzo Abe. And the current Ishiba government, as I learned from our mutual friend Tobias Harris, not the Detroit Pistons forward, but the great Japan analyst, Ishiba is not nearly as pragmatic as Abe was, and may like die on the hill in order to make a point. Like, this is not a government that is just going to reflexively do whatever Trump wants or thinks of itself in the context of like the way that Shinzo Abe positioned Japan generally. It's a much different. There's a different sheriff in town. That's like the worst comparison I could possibly use. So yeah, I think it's huge that Japan is not going along. And I think we should tie that off as our 10 minutes about Trump. Is there anything else you want to say about Trump before we move on to our last topic, Marko?
No, except that I am wrong that they don't import a lot of rice. They do, but they do also have huge tariffs outside of some of the trade. So
yes,
they both.
You were right on the grand strategy, but not on the specifics of rice. Yeah, that's which I
This
call
is
that
why
correct.
we have Google. This is why we have Google. We should have a fact checker, by the way. If anybody wants to become our fact checker and make us look stupid at the end of each podcast, please apply to our email address.
Yeah, there's that old interview that that Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford did once upon a time. They've told the story in a lot of different interviews since, but where like it's the scene in A New Hope where Mark Hamill's in the trash compactor and he gets all messy and things like that, and then they had to go shoot something the next day, and they were picking right up from there. And Mark Hamill objected and was like, guys, like I need to get all dirty again, because in the movie it's going to go from I'm looking dirty and I've got schmutz to I'm completely clean. Like, what are we going to do? And Harrison Ford goes like, kid, it's not that kind of movie. If people are looking at your hair, something has gone very, very wrong. So if people are looking to this for the absolutely perfect fact check information, not that we're going to give you fake stuff here, but I'm just saying, Marko,
Yeah.
if we need a fact checker, something has gone very wrong in the trash compactor. Okay. Last thing before I got to get out of here and get back into daddy mode. So when we were talking 10 minutes ago, Vice President Vance had just visited India. He had a lot of comments about the future of U.S.-India relations. Shortly around that time, there was a big terrorist attack in Kashmir, Indian-controlled Kashmir, disputed between Pakistan and India. And this was a religiously tinged attack. So Muslim terrorists who were going after specifically Hindu people in Kashmir. There were actually some really grisly stories about how they were like figuring out whether they were Hindu or not, like checking for circumcision or asking them to recite like verses from the like really like kind of scary stuff. And in response, India has suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, that may sound like nothing. That's a massive deal. It governs the water sharing between the two countries. 80% of Pakistani water for agriculture comes as a result, is allowed through this treaty. It survived 3 different India-Pakistan wars since 1960, survived the Mumbai attacks, survived everything else, and now it's been suspended. And India has been threatening that it's going to respond against Pakistan. The Pakistani government said that military action was imminent earlier this week. It has not happened yet, so how imminent can it be? Don't trust the Pakistanis when they say anything. They also said Osama wasn't in the country. Anyway, go down the list of things. But you two have 2 nuclear powers really mad at each other, suspending treaties, talking bad about each other. And then this also, I think, gives us the chance to talk about India in general and U.S.-India relations and where India is in the grand game of geopolitics. So where do you want to start, Marko?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things that's interesting is that these attacks have occurred around visits by U.S. officials to India in the past. So that is first interesting sort of tidbit, and this followed, obviously, Vice President Pence's visit. It's intended to sort of embarrass India. It's intended to, cause, obviously, carnage and retaliation. I mean, this is what the terrorists want. They want retaliation from India on Pakistan. The water agreement, it does not, from what I understand, and I did some research ahead of this podcast for it, it doesn't appear that India really has the means to cut off water now. But the water agreement is more about the future and about whether or not India builds more, hydropower onto Indus. On the other hand, we should also remember that Indus starts in Tibet, in China. So, this is one of those things, those little cartoons where like a large fish is eating a fish and then there's like an even bigger fish behind it. Mm-hmm. So just something to keep in mind. I mean, if India messes with Pakistan's water supply, Pakistan's traditional ally, China, could mess with India's. So I don't want to over-index on that. I think the bigger question is, for me, what is retaliation by India going to look like? And what is the re-retaliation by Pakistan going to look like? Because they've done this in the past, and it was choreographed, and it was sort of like, very much a phony conflict in the past. And there's a reason for this, because the two countries are nuclear powers. And in a way, it reminds me of what we went through last year with Israel and Iran. We may be living in this world, Jacob, of multipolarity, where mathematically speaking, conflict between countries is clearly more likely because you don't have one or two bullies keeping the world relatively stable. You have multiple pairings of potential conflict. At the same time, we're also in a world of multipolarity combined with nuclear weapons. And so, in that world, yes, countries are more likely to start something against one another, but they're also bound by that nuclear, obviously mutual assured destruction. So I think that what we're going to get is a rerun of Iran Israel 2024 experience, and I would need to be convinced otherwise. So I'm open to it, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Well, it's tough because, the odds of full on nuclear war between these two powers probably went from 0% to 2%, which is infinitesimal in the grand scheme of things, but also it's such a high magnitude event that you don't want to completely ignore it. To your point about it being a fake war, yes, there have been three different wars. India on paper should beat Pakistan every single time, but India's military forces are not so great, and the Indian population's tolerance for pain is less so than Pakistan's population. So it usually ends up just being a hold me back sort of fight, and nothing goes forward. I agree not to over-index too much on the Indus Waters Treaty, but I do think there are some interesting aspects of multipolarity coming out here, which is, India's banning trade with Pakistan as part of this, or at least has so far, talking about, oh, we're going to siphon this water off. We're going to go against some of these internationally recognized agreements on water when it comes to how we're going to deal with you. This goes a couple of years ago, India revoked the Kashmir region's special status because it was basically just going to assert itself, which India got no flack for. China rolled into Hong Kong, everybody was freaking out. India rolls into Kashmir. There's this double standard there that I always noted, and which always seemed a little bit strange to me. So I think you're right that we're not looking at nuclear war between these two countries and long-standing war. But as a proxy conflict, I think it is really interesting. Is the United States going to support India's position as India tries to consolidate control in Kashmir and maybe some other areas and really hurt the Pakistani economy? Is China going to be there to help the Pakistani economy? Are the Saudis or others in the Middle East going to look at this? They trade a lot with India. They want good trade ties with India. They talk a lot about the leadership of the Muslim world, and yet here is, a Muslim country in Pakistan that needs help, needs economic support, is facing a potential overreaction from its Hindu neighbor. It's not like the Pakistani government officially did this in Kashmir. One of the weirdest things about this attack is that nobody has really claimed responsibility for it. There was this one offshoot that first on social media claimed it, and then they came out and said, we got hacked. It wasn't us. We didn't mean to do it. So there's a lot of conspiracy theory in Pakistani media about, is this a false flag? Did India create this because they're trying to test their military, or because they want to show Vice President Vance what they're dealing with and how they need U.S. support? So I think you're right that as a proximate conflict itself, probably not that big of a deal, although I'm sitting up in my chair a little bit more and watching things go back and forth. But as a place to watch where multipolarity is unfolding, as a potential proxy conflict, watching what this is going to do for relations, either China-Pakistan or US-India or China-India. I mean, at the beginning of the year, you and I were talking about China and India not putting to bed, but at least pausing their own territorial spat over a line of control where they were having stupid little knife fights on the border. So it feels important, but maybe it's not. I don't know. You can, even as I try to talk about why this should be important, you can see I'm straining to actually hang my hat on anything concrete.
No. I think that that's all good points. I think traditionally speaking, when the world has been multipolar, which none of us really remember because we've never lived it, neither have our parents, and actually neither have our grandparents. So the most people index on either America being number one and just crushing everyone, which is no longer just the case. We see that, we're talking about that every time we're on this podcast. But I would say that most Americans think that it's a bipolar world because, the Soviet experience is just so etched in everyone's mind. Mm-hmm. Now, the bad thing, so if we go back to the 19th century, last time that the world was multipolar, there were wars all over the place all the time. All over the place all the time. And so that's not great for human existence, If we only look at it from sort of a human perspective of like what's good for humanity, a multipolar world tends to be problematic. And at least that's what scholarship shows. That's what political scientists and historians show. On the other hand, maybe that's because the data is from the 19th century. And if we update the data for technological innovation in the 21st century, aside from nuclear weapons, by the way, you also have a lot of autonomous ways to have a war. We're not that far off from a world where almost most surface ships, at least small ones, and aircraft are going to be autonomous. So if the Philippines and China want to have a go at it over some atoll, the actual political costs of doing that are pretty low, which increases the probability that it will take place. Because if you're just going to have robots fight each other out, like you're like, okay, cool, I lost, you won, whatever. I'm going to go rebuild some robots, but like 4 people died. And so that actually raises the probability for the conflict. And we saw that with Israel in Iran, because in 2024, now they didn't really use autonomous vehicles in any way, except Iran did use drones and so did Israel. But they used a lot of very sophisticated missiles, including Iran. Iran actually targeted Israeli military facilities almost exclusively, and it was clear that it did so. And then Israel's highly sophisticated air defense systems took them all out. And then when Israel attacked Iran, again, it was very much targeted. And, I think Israel lost one person. Ironically, I believe a Palestinian died from the shrapnel of an Iranian missile. So, but don't quote me on that. We can obviously Google that too, and vice versa. So, what I'm getting at here is that this is a concern. The frequency with which we have Israel versus Iran, we have India now versus Pakistan, and you could have many, many other conflicts as well. On the other hand, maybe the technological innovation since 1914 could actually keep this multipolar period from descending into very large scale wars. Of course, that wasn't the case when Russia invaded Ukraine. But had Ukraine had nuclear weapons, I'm pretty sure that would not have happened.
Well, and to your point, Vladimir Putin is not a child of a multipolar world.
Yeah.
Okay. Before we get out of here, basketball. The Lakers are out. Do you even want to talk about this? Is it too painful? Is the wound too bare? And who do you think is going to win the NBA final?
Okay, so first of all, you asked us to come prepared with overreactions, right? You wanted us to talk about overreaction. Here's one that I want to just light myself on fire for. Nico Harrison was right. Please. You know what I mean? Like, what? The Lakers did not trade Luka Doncic to win the title in 2025. So I am, I'm comfortable with the result. I mean, it is what it is. I did think they would beat the Timberwolves, but it was a low conviction view. They really did look really good for the past month or so. Their defense was one of the best in the NBA. And Luka, LeBron, and Austin Reeves looked really difficult. Like 3 guys who can start, who can be the head of the snake. You have a 3-headed snake. Like that looked really good in the games I watched. And then, Rudy Gobert basically had like a Shaq-like game because the average height of the Lakers was, basically 5 inches shorter. And so what I would say is that I'm not too concerned as a Laker fan. You've got a 26-year-old superstar whose biggest problem is that he likes iced tea and Twinkies too much. Like, I'm fine with that. Like, get him on a diet. It's LA. Get him on a beach. When he realizes that like 85% of men in Los Angeles have a more fit body than he does, and they are not professional athletes, I think Luka will just be embarrassed into working out a little bit. Not too much though, because for the Lakers to be successful, he's got to keep that large derriere. That is clearly his superpower. So I'm not that worried about it. I don't know. You tell me. Should I be worried about it?
I think you were right up until the last thing. Like, Luka needs to get in shape. Like, because if he doesn't get in shape, like, it's not quite Embiid territory, but like he has two choices here. Like he can either become the next Kobe or he will become some version of Joel Embiid. So he can either have one of the greatest careers in NBA history and bring the Lakers to multiple titles, or he'll be lucky if he gets one. By the time he's 32, he's going to be breaking down. Maybe sooner, because he's been playing, since he was a teenager, and who knows how long all those miles adding up is going to be, and who knows what the LA nightlife is going to do to him. So I think you're absolutely right up until you said that it doesn't matter that Luka needs to get in shape. Like
no,
he
I
needs to
said
get in
he
shape.
does.
And your boy JJ Redick, like his first comments, he was sounding like Pat Riley. He was basically like, "We need to get in shape," and that was Nico's point. So, but
just to be clear, all I said is I want him to keep his big fat ass. That's all I said. You can be in shape and have chunkiness. Nikola Jokic did not lose weight. Like he's in shape, but he still looks like chunky. Paul Pierce never had muscle definition, and in fact, I think the best attribute of his physical appearance was the fact that you could not get around his ass. You would have to call an Uber to go from his left hip to his right hip. And so that's all I'm saying. Like, I don't want Luka Doncic to look like he did when he was 18. I've heard some people say, like, oh, he's going to look. No. What makes him impossible to drive is his girth, and how big he is. But he's got to be, as you say, he's got to have that cardio. So I think we in America, in North America, in maybe the Western world, although I don't think this is the case in Europe, but there's this obsession with like muscle definition, abs, looking shredded. And the fact of the matter is like, man, that does not mean you're fit. You can have abs and have 6% body fat, but you may not be able to go up and down the court. And I definitely don't want Luka to ever have abs, like facts. But I do want him to not look, like a 47-year-old like housewife on a treadmill in the fourth quarter. I flushed in the face. Like, like you can't start looking like pink, like in the fourth quarter.
Lay off the Twinkies and do your drinking in the off season. I know Larry Bird used to drink beer famously, but he's not Larry Bird, and this is a different era. So come on.
Well, I do think Larry Bird. Just I do want to say one more thing. It goes beyond that. I gotta stay consistent, and I can't be a fanboy of Luka and then have all this criticism for James Harden. And I never liked James Harden, the 5-and-out heliocentric style of playing. I never liked it. And I think that if you want to, if for me to be objective, I have to say that that's the other thing I would want to see. I would want to see Luka play more like Larry Bird. And that means off the ball. Larry Bird wasn't out there dribbling for 20 seconds and then deciding what to do. He didn't average 12 assists because he didn't have to average 12 assists. He moved. He had spots on the elbow. He would post up. He would have an easier way. So one of the reasons that Luka has to be in shape is because he dribbles all the time. And he needs to be off the ball more often. Something that James Harden never learned how to do. And that's why I don't think teams where he was the best player and number one option never won a championship.
What's your finals prediction before we get out of here?
Oh, man. It's just like, you're so mean. I don't want to talk about it.
I know.
Because it's like, obviously, it's going to be the freaking Celtics, and then I really don't think Oklahoma City deserves to ever win anything. They stole the team from Seattle. I think as long as there are no Seattle Supersonics, I cannot stomach Oklahoma City winning a title. So I'm really hoping they don't make it to the finals. I'm so zealous on this point, Jacob, that I would cheer for the Celtics over the Thunder in the finals as a Laker fan.
Okay. So Celtics Thunder, and you think who's winning? You're probably the Celtics, but you hate it. Okay.
Well, what's yours?
Here's my hot take: Boston, Minnesota, Wolves in 7. You heard it here first. I'm an Ant believer, and now that Rudy Gobert has decided to leave his body and become Shaquille O'Neal slashed with Sean Bradley, this is great. I'm ready to watch it. They got seasoned last year. Like last year, they took their licks. This is going to be the year that OKC takes its licks. Like Ant is going to eat them up, and Rudy is going to deal with Chet. And
the problem with that forecast is that it requires Randall to play like he did just now for 3 more series. I was always a Randall defender. I own a condo on his island, on Randall Island, but like that is what you would have to bet on. But you know what? I actually call that at the beginning of the season. A friend of mine was like, hey, who do you think is going to be the finals? I thought it was going to be the Timberwolves and Celtics, exactly for all the reasons you said. And the other one was that I thought that Randall would have a chip on his shoulder. And he didn't until this series against the Lakers. So there you go. That's a cool pick, man. Respect.
You were very kind to say that what was wrong with that pick was Julius Randle. What's wrong with that forecast is that it's probably wrong, but that's fine. You're not here for correct interpretations. So, all right, we'll leave it there.